My name is Claire Dawson, and for most of my life I was told to act like a Dawson, whatever that meant. In our family, appearances weren't just valued, they were everything. Dinner tables weren't where we broke bread, they were where reputations were measured. Brand names were casually dropped, and success was tallied in square footage and luxury tags. I remember sitting through countless Sunday suppers at my grandparents' estate just outside Seattle, watching uncles debate equity markets while my cousins compared yacht lengths like baseball cards. Everyone seemed to know exactly who they were because they were told exactly what they were worth. Except me, I didn't fit the mold. I didn't want the penthouse. I didn't want the attention. I wanted purpose. I wanted something that didn't disappear when the economy dipped or the nameplate changed. But in a world where value is mistaken for visibility, living quietly felt like failure, especially when your last name is Dawson. I still remember the day my aunt leaned across the linen draped table, her voice laced with something between pity and disappointment, and said, "Claire, sweetheart, what do you even do again?" I smiled, polite and practiced. "I work in housing," I replied. They all assumed I was struggling. None of them knew that I was already buying the building they were sitting in. Sunday dinners with the Dawson family were less about connection and more about currency, social, financial, and emotional. The kind of event where you dressed for judgment, not comfort. Every detail was a silent competition. Shoes polished, nails manicured, even your posture somehow mattered. I used to think I was imagining it until I watched my cousin Marcus spend 15 minutes debating whether to sit next to the fireplace or the wine cellar, calculating which would offer the better lighting for his Rolex. Conversations weren't just conversations, they were curated performances. "We just closed on a new building downtown," someone would say, pausing long enough to let the envy bloom. "Bought out the old tenants, made room for a boutique brand." The table would nod approvingly, clinking glasses to the idea of cleansing communities in the name of luxury. I'd sit quietly spooning mashed potatoes onto my plate, thinking of the families I'd met, families who'd lived in those buildings for generations, who suddenly found themselves priced out, unheard, erased. What struck me most wasn't the wealth, it was the pride in being indifferent. I learned something at those dinners: when success becomes a spotlight instead of a shelter, people forget how to offer shade to others. They only know how to burn brighter, no matter who gets scorched along the way. They never asked about the kind of work I did, just where I did it. To them, value is measured by zip code. But I had already stopped seeking their approval. I was building something bigger, not taller, but deeper. Something that couldn't be flaunted across a dinner table, but would last far longer than the dessert tray. And ironically, it all started with the one job they found most embarrassing: a modest apartment complex, tucked between a public park and an old train line. The place where my legacy truly began. I didn't choose the small life because I lacked ambition. I chose it because I knew what the big one had cost us. When I was 10, we lost our family home. Not the Dawson estate with manicured hedges and fountains that always stayed safe, protected by trust funds and tax shelters. I'm talking about the modest brownstone where my mother and I lived just outside Queen Anne Hill. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, until it wasn't. One year after a risky investment deal gone wrong, my uncle, then in charge of managing family funds, used it as collateral without telling us. When it fell through, we were politely relocated. No lawsuit, no apology, just silence. I watched my mother pack our memories into boxes we didn't have space for. She cried in the kitchen and told me it was just a place. But I knew better. It was her independence, her pride, her ground to stand on. And it was taken just like that. Years later, when I had the chance to invest, I didn't look for luxury. I looked for neighborhoods like ours, ignored, overlooked, but full of life. I bought my first building in Eastwood. It was crumbling cheap and close to the freeway. But the rent was fair, the tenants were kind, and I saw something beautiful in the worn staircases and sun-faded walls. People used to ask me, why not go bigger? I always smiled and said, because I want to build better. Better doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it just needs to last. That little Eastwood building became the first seed of Riverstone Collective. I poured my time savings and Saturday mornings into restoring it. No evictions, no flashy upgrades, just respect. What I learned is this: small isn't weak. It's often where strength begins, quietly, steadily, without permission. And while my family expanded their empire skyward, I chose to plant roots. They saw square footage, I saw foundation. And it wouldn't be long before those foundations would be strong enough to shake theirs. Riverstone Collective didn't start with a boardroom or a bold mission statement. It started with one building, one broken railing, and one tenant who brought me cookies when I fixed it myself instead of calling a contractor. I didn't even name the company until the second year. I was too busy repairing leaky pipes and filing paperwork for housing grants. It was just me, my laptop, and a few good hearted people who believed that tenants shouldn't have to fear the first of the month. The name came to me while walking along the river one spring morning. There was this stretch of stones worn smooth by time, and water quiet, strong, unshaken. That's what I wanted to build. Not a real estate empire, but a refuge. Something that could bend without breaking, a company rooted in trust, not pressure. I filed the LLC under a third party trust. Not for secrecy, but for space. I knew if the Dawsons caught wind of it too soon, they'd try to shape it, dress it up in sharp suits and marketing lingo. So I kept it simple, anonymous, ethical, consistent. Within 5 years, Riverstone held 9 properties across the Pacific Northwest. Not high-rises, not resorts, just sturdy lived-in homes that deserved more time and less judgment. We worked quietly, paid contractors fairly, offered leases with dignity, no flashy branding, just good results. The family never asked, because in their eyes, anything not loud must be small, and anything small must be insignificant. But insignificance doesn't file quiet bids on commercial properties. It doesn't win public restoration grants or get recognized by local housing advocates. And it certainly doesn't buy 51% of Dawson Square, the flagship building of the family trust. Yet that's exactly what Riverstone did, quietly, thoroughly, and without permission. Because I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. I was writing my own. And soon the ripple they ignored would become the current they couldn't stop. It started with a letter, not to me, but to the Dawson Family Trust. A quiet envelope with a government seal and a single word that changed everything audit. At first, no one took it seriously. My Uncle Todd joked that it was routine stuff, just the IRS fishing for errors. But I knew better. I had seen the signs months earlier. Vendors' unpaid duplicate invoices, reports delayed or mysteriously revised. And I had friends, people who worked behind the scenes in city housing departments, people who noticed when figures didn't line up and stories didn't match. The Dawsons had built their empire quickly and loudly. But when you grow too fast, you stop paying attention to the cracks. And sometimes, the things you dismiss as details are the very things that bring you down. The audit wasn't just financial, it was ethical. A deep dive into how the family leveraged their holdings, how they funneled maintenance budgets into personal trips labeled luxury items as office upgrades, and pushed out low-income tenants to boost short-term returns. The Trust's flagship property, Dawson Square, was the epicenter. And Riverstone Collective, the company they still hadn't connected to me, was now the majority stakeholder. That meant I had a say, a seat at the table, and a responsibility. I didn't order the audit, but I didn't stop it either, because sometimes silence isn't complicity, it's strategy. What the Dawsons didn't realize was that while they were measuring their empire in glass and gold, I was watching the foundation rot. I wasn't rooting for their downfall. I was preparing for a rebuild. And when the findings started surfacing, when the media got wind of it, when legal advisors whispered words like misappropriation and breach of fiduciary duty, the family started looking for someone to blame. That's when they turned to me. Claire, my aunt called one afternoon voice, sweet like syrup. You're in property management, right? Maybe you know someone who could help smooth this out. I told her I'd see what I could do. And I meant it. Just not the way she hoped. The morning of the Dawson Trust board meeting, I chose flats over heels. A navy blazer, not black. Simple gold earrings my mother once wore to her first job interview. Nothing flashy, just quietly deliberate. Because real power doesn't need a microphone. It doesn't need to echo, it just needs to be. When I arrived, the room was already full family members at one end, legal counsel scattered along the sides, a few uneasy board members flipping through binders. I could feel the tension before I even stepped through the door. Eyes darted up, some confused, some dismissive, some panicked. My cousin Marcus whispered something under his breath. Probably a joke. I didn't hear it. I didn't need to. I walked calmly to the head of the table and placed my briefcase down. Claire, my Uncle Todd said, half rising from his chair, I think this meeting is for equity stakeholders only. I know I said gently, that's why I'm here. I opened the folder. Inside the proof. Riverstone's purchase of Dawson Square, financial records, legal authority, all signed, filed, and complete. For a moment there was silence. Then it cracked. Whispers, stammered questions, narrowed eyes trying to put the pieces together. But you manage properties, someone said. Yes, I replied, and I own this one. It's funny how quickly the tone shifts when people realize they've misread you, how those who once spoke over you begin to listen. How the ones who called you small suddenly lean in. I didn't yell, I didn't gloat. I simply opened the audit findings and began walking them through their own story, one that until that day, they thought they controlled. Because sometimes the most radical thing you can do is show up in a room that never expected you and take your rightful place. And now that I had their attention, it was time to answer the question they didn't even know they should have asked. Why didn't I tear it all down? They expected me to demolish it, to kick them out, to sell it off, to turn Dawson Square into a monument of revenge. A few in the room probably even braced for it, ready to cry betrayal if I did what they'd always feared, become just like them. But that was never the point. When I bought Dawson Square, it wasn't to get even. It was to finally get right what generations before me had gotten so wrong. The building wasn't just valuable because of its address, it was valuable because of the people inside it. The small bookshop run by Mr. Evans for 31 years, the elderly couple on the third floor who planted roses in the shared courtyard, the single mom who kept the stairwell spotless even though she never asked for anything in return. I kept their leases exactly as they were. No rent hikes, no threats, just renewed commitment. Instead of tearing down, I chose to restore brick by brick without displacement. We preserved the original windows, repaired the murals in the foyer, installed a community board in the lobby to post local events and birthdays. Little things, quiet things. Because the truth is, legacies don't have to be loud to be lasting. What I learned is this: destroying something out of anger may feel powerful, but preserving it with purpose takes more strength. My family didn't understand that kind of strength yet, but they were about to learn. Because the moment this story hit the press, the moment the world found out the Dawson family's forgotten daughter now ran the block they once ruled, that's when the real shift would begin. The headline hit just after 9 a.m. Claire Dawson revealed as CEO of Riverstone Collective, now majority owner of Dawson Square. In the photo, I stood in front of the building my family once used as a symbol of legacy. No filters, no glossy press kit, just me, a navy coat, and a simple smile that said, "Yes, it's true, and yes, I built it myself." By noon, the phones at the Dawson family office were ringing off the hook. Reporters, former investors, even old acquaintances from prep school trying to reconnect. The narrative was shifting fast. For the first time, the Dawson name wasn't tied to aspiration, it was tied to investigation. Uncle Todd canceled his afternoon golf game. Aunt Marilyn went silent on social media. My cousin Marcus changed his LinkedIn headline from VP of Development to Open to Work. Behind closed doors, panic turned to spin. They debated damage control strategies, drafted half-hearted statements, and asked lawyers if there was any way to claw back the sale. There wasn't. But beyond the scandal, something quieter was happening. People were paying attention to the how, not just the what. Riverstone wasn't a flashy disruptor. It was a reminder. That development could be done with care. That ownership didn't have to come at the cost of community. That ethics weren't just a branding term, they were a blueprint. The lesson: when you build something rooted in integrity, it speaks for itself. Loud voices may dominate the room at first, but truth carries farther, especially when the wind shifts. And that shift had only just begun. Because as the press unraveled the surface, they started digging deeper into one question my family had never cared enough to ask. What does legacy really mean? Legacy to my family had always been defined by what was left behind: properties, trust funds, oil paintings, and gilded frames. It was about permanence, about nameplates on buildings and donors' walls. But legacy, I've learned, is not about what you leave. It's about what lasts, and more importantly, what lives on through others. One evening, a week after the media storm quieted, I took a walk through Dawson Square, now restored and humming with life. I passed the bookshop where Mr. Evans was hosting a poetry night. The small courtyard garden had been replanted by 2 teenage tenants as part of a summer project. And upstairs, I heard a little girl practicing the violin. Her mother later told me that having a stable home was the first time she'd allowed herself to dream beyond next month's rent. That to me is legacy. Not the square footage I owned, but the peace I helped protect. Not the brand I built, but the barriers I lowered. Not the praise I received, but the permission I gave others to stay, grow, and belong. And funny enough, it was through rebuilding Dawson Square, the very place that once symbolized everything cold and untouchable about our family, that I finally understood what my great-grandfather must have believed when he laid the first bricks of our name. He didn't do it for applause. He did it because shelter is sacred. That realization changed something in me, and perhaps more surprisingly, it began to change something in them. Because when I sent out invitations for the first ever holiday open house at the building, I didn't expect many RSVPs, especially not from them, but the night of the party, I saw familiar last names walking toward the courtyard. And what happened next? Well, that was something even I couldn't have planned. The courtyard was strung with fairy light, simple but soft, casting a golden warmth over the ivy covered brick and winter green hedges. Tenants brought folding chairs, kids wore handmade paper crowns, and someone had rigged a speaker to play a scratchy mix of jazz and holiday classics. There was hot cider, mismatched mugs, and laughter rising in little bursts like candlelight. I didn't expect them to come. But they did. My mother arrived first, wearing jeans and no makeup, which said more than any apology could. She stood quietly near the dessert table, watching as Mrs. Lopez, a tenant of 38 years, handed out slices of her famous rum cake. My cousin Marcus helped Mr. Keller, our oldest resident, hang snowflake garlands across the entry arch. Even my Uncle Todd stood awkwardly beside the cocoa pot, chatting with two teenagers who'd recently started an after-school art club in the basement community room. No one made grand speeches. No one brought gifts. They just showed up in the most human, unguarded way I'd ever seen. And that night, for the first time, I saw our family name, not as a burden or a brand, but as a bridge. Not built from wealth, but from willingness. Willingness to learn, to unlearn, to begin again. My dad found me by the garden fountain as the music faded into the background. You know, he said, your great-grandfather believed buildings should shelter hearts, not just wallets. I nodded slowly. I found his old ledgers, I told him. Handwritten notes about tenant protections, rent forgiveness. He knew. We just forgot. He looked at me not as someone who'd rebelled, but as someone who'd remembered. Someone who'd carried the torch he let go of long ago. You could have ruined us, he said quietly. That was never the point, I replied, watching a little girl twirl beneath the lights. I just wanted to build something that would outlast me. And maybe that's the truest version of success, not proving others wrong, but offering them a better version of right. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed for choosing a quieter path, then maybe you see a little of yourself in me. I didn't set out to win. I set out to build something real, something rooted in values, not vanity, something no one could take away because it wasn't borrowed. It was earned. And if my story moved you, I'd love to hear yours. What have you built in silence while others doubted you? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about the quiet work, the long nights, the inner strength it takes to create what no one claps for yet. And if you're facing that moment now, the moment when the world expects nothing from you, don't shout louder, just build stronger. You don't need permission to begin. You just need purpose. So subscribe, stay with me, and let's build something that lasts.